Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe. Today we're going to look at one of the UK's most infamous and dangerous hackers and look into the story of why the US government wanted to hand him an almost guaranteed life sentence to serve at Guantanamo Bay. This was after he said he was only looking for evidence of UFOs and renewable energy. Gary McKinnon, who was born on the 10th of February 1966, is a Scottish systems administrator and hacker who was accused in 2002 of perpetrating the biggest military computer hack of all time. Although Mr McKinnon himself states that he was merely looking for evidence of free energy suppression, a cover-up of UFO activity, as well as other technologies that could be potentially useful to the public. On the 16th of October 2012, after a series of legal proceedings in Britain, the Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, blocked the extradition to the United States. But why did the British government decide not to extradite Mr McKinnon after he had hacked one of the biggest military corporations in America? Surely this did not go down well between the UK and US relations. Today we take a deeper look into the life of Gary McKinnon and what really happened. Mr. Gary McKinnon was accused of hacking into 97 United States military and NASA computers over a 13-month period, which was between February 2001 and March 2002, whilst he was at the house of his girlfriend's aunt in London. He did this using the name Solo. The US authorities stated that he deleted critical files from operating systems, which had shut down the United States Army Military District of Washington network, which consisted of 2,000 computers. The computers were shut down for 24 hours. Mr. McKinnon also posted a notice on the military's website saying, "Your security is crap." It is also alleged that after September 11th attacks in 2001, he allegedly deleted important weapon logs that were being held in the Earle Naval Weapons Station, rendering its network of 300 computers, making them completely inoperable and paralysing the munition supply for the US Navy's Atlantic Fleet. Mr McKinnon was also accused of copying data, account files and passwords onto his own computer. The US authorities stated that the cost of tracking and correcting the problems that Mr McKinnon had caused was well over $700,000. While not admitting that it constituted evidence of destruction, Mr McKinnon did admit to leaving a threat on one computer. The message he left on the US government computer was as follows: US foreign policy is akin to government-sponsored terrorism these days. It was not a mistake that there was a huge security stand down on September 11th last year. I am Solo. I will continue to destruct at the highest levels. However, the US authorities have stated that they believe Mr McKinnon was in fact trying to downplay his own actions. A highly decorated and senior military officer at the Pentagon had said, "The US policy is to fight these cyber attacks as strongly as possible, and as a result of Mr McKinnon's actions, we had suffered serious damage. This was not some harmless incident. He did very serious and deliberate damage, and he did so to US military and NASA computers." Mr McKinnon also left behind silly and anti-American messages. All the evidence above suggests that someone was staging a very serious attack on US computer systems. Mr McKinnon was first interviewed by the police on the 19th of March 2002. After this interview, his computer was seized by the authorities. He was then again interviewed on the 8th of August 2002. This time it was by the UK National High-Tech Crime Unit, or the NHTCU. In November 2002, Mr McKinnon was indicted on a federal grand jury in the Eastern District of Virginia. The indictment contains 7 counts of computer-related crime, each of which carried a potential of 10 years sentence in jail. Mr McKinnon remained at liberty without restriction for 3 years until June of 2005, until after the UK enacted the Extradition Act of 2003, which implemented the 2003 Extradition Treaty with the United States, wherein the United States did not need to provide contestable evidence. Mr McKinnon now became subject to bail conditions, including a requirement to sign in at his local police station every evening and to remain at his home address every night. If extradited to the US and charged, Mr McKinnon could have potentially faced up to 70 years in jail. Mr McKinnon had also expressed fears that he could be extradited and sent to Guantanamo Bay. Representing Mr McKinnon in the House of Lords on the 16th of June 2008, the barristers told the law lords that the prosecutors had said that Mr McKinnon faced a possible 8 to 10 years in jail per count if he contested to the charges. There were 7 counts altogether, without any chance of reparation, but he would only receive between 37 and 46 months if he cooperated and went voluntary to the United States. The US-style plea bargains are not part of English criminal law, except in exceptional circumstances, although it is standard practice to reduce the sentence by 1/3 if a defendant pleads guilty early. Mr McKinnon's lawyers contended that this effect was intimidation and by the US using force to force Mr McKinnon to waive his legal rights. Mr McKinnon had also stated that he had been told he could serve part of his sentence in the UK if he cooperated. He rejected the offer because the Americans would not agree to this condition. Mr McKinnon's barrister said that the law lords looking over the case, that they could deny the extradition if there was an abuse of process, saying, if the United States wishes to use the process of the English courts to secure an extradition of an alleged offender, then they must play by our rules. The House Lords rejected this argument, with the lead judgment of Lord Brown of Eton under Haywood, holding that the difference between the American system and our own is not perhaps so stark as Mr McKinnon's argument suggests, and that the extradition proceedings should accommodate legal and cultural differences between the legal system and many foreign-friendly states, with whom the UK has entered into a reciprocal extradition agreement. Mr McKinnon appealed to the European Courts of Human Rights, which briefly imposed a bar on the extradition, but a request for an appeal was later rejected. On the 23rd of January 2009, Mr McKinnon won permission from the High Court to apply for a judicial review against his extradition. However, on the 31st of July 2009, the High Court announced that Mr McKinnon had lost his appeal. Mr McKinnon's legal team, his solicitor Karen Todner and his barrister Ben Cooper, applied for a judicial review into the Home Secretary's rejection and medical evidence, which stated that when he could be easily tried in the UK, it was unnecessary, cruel and inhumane to inflict further stress of removing him from his homeland, his family and his medical support network. On the 16th of October 2012, the then Home Secretary Theresa May announced that the House of Commons had decided that the extradition had been blocked, saying that Mr McKinnon is accused of serious crimes, but there is also no doubt that he is very seriously ill. He has Asperger's syndrome and suffers from depressive illness. Mr McKinnon's extradition will give rise to such a high risk of him ending his life that the decision was made not to extradite him, and it would be incompatible with Mr McKinnon's human rights. She stated that the Director of Public Prosecutions would determine whether Mr McKinnon should face trial before a British court. On the 14th of December, the DPP, Keir Starmer, announced that Mr McKinnon would not be prosecuted in the United Kingdom because of the difficulties involving in bringing his case against him when the evidence was all in the United States. In January of 2010, Mr Justice Mitting granted Mr McKinnon a further judicial review on the decision of the Home Secretary at the time, Alan Johnson, to allow Mr McKinnon's extradition. Mr Justice Mitting distinguished two issues which were arguable. The first being whether the psychiatrist Jeremy Turk's opinion that Mr McKinnon would most certainly commit suicide if extradited to the US, and this meant that the Home Secretary must refuse extradition under the Section 6 of the Human Rights Act of 1998, which prevents a public authority from acting in a way incompatible with the Convention right. The second was whether Mr Turk's opinion was a fundamental change to the circumstances that the courts had previously considered and ruled upon. Mr Justice Mitting ruled that if the answer to both questions was yes, then it was arguable that it would be unlawful to allow the extradition. In early November 2008, 80 British MPs signed an early day motion calling for any custodial sentence imposed by an American court to be served in a UK prison. On the 15th of July 2009, many voted in Parliament against a review of the extradition treaty. In November of 2008, the rock group Marillion announced that it was ready to participate in a benefit concert in support of Mr McKinnon's struggle to avoid extradition to the United States. The organiser of the planned event was Ross Hemsworth, an English radio host. Many prominent individuals voiced support, including Sting, Trudy Styler, Julie Christine, David Glimmer, Graham Nash, Peter Gabriel, The Proclaimers, Bob Geldof, Christy Hyde, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, Stephen Fry and Terry Waite, and all of them proposed that he should at least be tried in the UK. The Scottish entrepreneur Luke Heron would pay £100,000 toward Mr McKinnon's legal costs in the event he was extradited to the US. In another article, Joseph Gutthines Jr., a retired NASA officer of the Inspector General's Senior Special Agent, voiced his support for Mr McKinnon. Mr Gutthines, who is also an American criminal defense lawyer and a former member of the Texas Criminal Justice Advisory Committee on Offenders with Medical and Mental Impairments, said that he feared Gary McKinnon would not find justice in the US because, in his opinion, the American justice system turns a blind eye towards anyone who is mentally ill. Janice Sharp, Mr McKinnon's mother, stood as an independent candidate in the 2010 general election in Blackburn in protest against the sitting Labour MP Jack Straw, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time when the extradition treaty was agreed. She unfortunately finished last out of the 8 candidates with a 0.38% of the vote. On the 20th of July 2010, Tom Brady, ITN's political editor, raised the Gary McKinnon issue with the US. President Barack Obama and Prime Minister David Cameron were in a joint White House press conference, and they responded that they had discussed it and were working to find an appropriate solution. In 2009, Pink Floyd's David Glimmer released an online single, Chicago, Changed the World, on which he sang and played the guitar, bass and keyboards to promote awareness of Mr McKinnon's plight. A retitled cover of the Graham Nash song, Chicago, it featured Chrissie Hynde and Bob Geldof, plus Mr McKinnon himself. It was produced by the longtime Pink Floyd collaborator Chris Thomas, and it was made with Mr Nash's support. Mr McKinnon has admitted in many public statements that he did obtain unauthorized access to the computer systems in the United States, including those that are mentioned in the United States indictment. He states that his motivation was drawn from a statement made from the Washington Press Club on the 9th of May 2001 called The Disclosure Project. Mr McKinnon was looking to find evidence of UFOs, anti-gravity technology and suppression of free energy, all of which he states has been proven through his actions. In an interview on televised BBC Click programme, Mr McKinnon states that he was able to get into the military network simply by using a Perl script, which searched for blank passwords. In other words, his report suggests that the computers on these networks were simply just default at the time he hacked. In his interview with the BBC, he also stated that the Disclosure Project that was very credible and very relied upon people were all saying that yes, there is UFO technology, there is anti-gravity technology, and there is free energy, and it's all extraterrestrial in origin, and they've captured spacecrafts and reverse engineered them. Mr McKinnon said he investigated a NASA photographic expert's claim that the Johnson Space Center's Building A images were regularly cleaned of UFO evidence and craft by comparing the raw originals with the processed images. He stated to have viewed a detailed image of something not of man-made and a cigar shaped floating above the northern hemisphere, and assuming his viewing would be undisrupted owing to the hour that he had, he did not think of capturing the image because he was bedazzled by even seeing it in the first place, and therefore he did not think of securing it with the screen capture function in the software at this point when his connection was interrupted. In 2006, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed with NASA for all the documents pertaining to Gary McKinnon. NASA's documents consisted of printed news articles from a Slashdot site, but no other related documents. This was consistent with NASA employees browsing internet articles about Gary McKinnon. The records of such browsing activity are public domain. The FOIA documents have been uploaded to the internet for review and can be downloaded by anyone. The Crown Prosecution Service has announced that the computer hacker Gary McKinnon, whose extradition to the US was blocked, will not face charges in the UK, bringing an end to a 10-year legal battle. But who is Mr McKinnon? In March 2002, the Glasgow-born Mr McKinnon was arrested by the police in his small flat in Wood Green, North London. The Scotland Yard detectives at the time were acting on allegations from the Americans that he had hacked into US military computers in an attempt to bring them down. He allegedly immobilized sensitive systems in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. Mr McKinnon admits that he did hack into the US computers, but said that he had been on a moral crusade to find classified documents about unidentified flying objects. He got his first computer when he was 14 years old. 3 years later, he left school and became a hairdresser. But in the early 1990s, friends convinced him to get a qualification in computers. After completing this course, he started doing contract work in the computer field. By the late 1990s, Mr McKinnon decided to use his hacking skills to research his belief that the US government was withholding critical information about UFOs. His search quickly turned into an obsession. The Americans continued to press for the extradition of Mr McKinnon, who they say caused $800,000 worth of damage to computers that were in their system. If he was to be convicted at that time, he faced up to 70 years in prison. Completely unknown at the time of his arrest, Mr McKinnon became a symbol of controversial US and UK extradition treaty, gaining a wealth of celebrity backers. In August 2008, Mr McKinnon was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, a form of autism. He was diagnosed after an expert in autism watched him on a television show and contacted his solicitor. The initial hunch was confirmed by Professor Simon Baron Cohen, a leader in the field of autism. People who suffer with Asperger's syndrome become obsessed with certain activities and interests, and are known to have a level of social naivety when it comes to evaluating the consequences of their own actions. Professor Baron Cohen said that this was consistent with Mr McKinnon's obsessive search for the truth. It claimed that between February 2001 and March 2002, Mr McKinnon hacked into dozens of US Army, US Navy, and the US Air Force, as well as hacking in Department of Defense computers. It was also alleged that he hacked into 16 NASA computers. The American government also alleged that he altered and deleted files at a US Naval air station not long after the terrorist attacks that happened on the 11th of September 2001. They described Mr McKinnon's hacking as intentional and calculated to influence and affect the US government by intimidation and coercion. But Mr McKinnon, or Solo as he was known online, has always said he is no web vandal, nor a virus writer, and he never acted with any malicious intent. In a BBC interview in 2005, he said, "I just found out that the US military uses Windows, and having realised this, I assumed that they would have been an easy hack if they hadn't secured it properly." Using a commercially available software known as Perl script, Mr McKinnon hacked dozens of US military and government networks. He found that many machines were inadequate without any password or firewall protection, so he simply just hacked into them, he said. In 2009, he told the BBC, "I am not blind to criminality, but I was on a moral crusade. I was convinced, and there was good evidence to show, that a certain secretive parts of the American government intelligence agency did have access to crashed extraterrestrial technology, which could, in these days, save us from a free-form, clean and pollution-free type of energy." He added, "I thought if someone was holding on to that information, that is unconstitutional under American law. I didn't think about jail sentences at the time. I had stopped washing at one point. I wasn't even looking after myself. I wasn't eating properly. I was just sitting around the house in my dressing gown, doing this all night," he said. Mr McKinnon did not try very hard to cover his tracks, even using his own email address. When Britain's high-tech crime unit finally came from him in 2002, Mr McKinnon said he was not at the slightest surprised. He said, "I almost wanted to be caught, because it was ruining me. I had this classic thing of wanting to be caught so there would be an end to it." Mr McKinnon thought he would be tried in Britain, and that he might get, at the most, 3 to 4 years in prison. But the Gary McKinnon saga had dragged on for 10 years, and in that time, there had been 7 Home Secretaries. During that time, he appealed unsuccessfully to the House of Lords and to the European Courts of Human Rights. One of his major arguments against the extradition was he believed that he would not get a fair trial in the US and would be punished more severely because he had contested the extradition process in the first place. The case had been in Theresa May's box since she became Home Secretary in 2010, and in October, she finally ruled that he should not be extradited. She said there was no doubt Mr McKinnon was seriously ill, and if this extradition was to take place, there would be a very high risk to him ending his life. Now, the Director of Public Prosecutions has ruled Mr McKinnon will not face any charges in the US. This brought an end to his 10-year battle. This is a statement from the joint CPS and MPS on the case of Gary McKinnon. The statement is by Keir Starmer QC, the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service on the case of Gary McKinnon. Between the 1st of February 2001 and the 19th of March 2002, Gary McKinnon allegedly gained unauthorized access to 97 US government computers. An investigation was launched by the US and a request for assistance was made to the National High-Tech Crime Unit in England and Wales. Following discussions between the US Department of Justice and the police and the Crown Prosecution Service in the autumn of 2002, a decision was taken that the appropriate place for Mr McKinnon to be tried was the United States. The reasons for that decision were as followed. The harm occurred in the US. The activity was directed against the military infrastructure of the US. An investigation had already been launched in the US. There was a large number of witnesses, most of whom were located in the US. All the physical evidence, with the exception of Mr McKinnon's computer, was located in the US. The US prosecutors were able to bring the case that reflected the full extent of Mr McKinnon's alleged criminality, and the bulk of the unused material was located in the US. Given the nature of the offence, this inevitably included highly sensitive information, and US courts were best placed to deal with any issues arising in relation to this material. As a result, the US sought Mr McKinnon's extradition from England and Wales for trial in the US. The decision that the appropriate place for Mr McKinnon to be tried was the US was affirmed in 2009 and subsequently challenged in the High Court. That challenge failed, as Lord Justice Stanley Burton in his judgment said, "It is the decision of the DPP, which I consider to be lawful and unchallengeable, not to prosecute him here. The USA is an appropriate forum for his prosecution." On the 16th of October 2012, the Home Secretary decided not to extradite Mr McKinnon to the US on the basis of his health. She also announced that it was now for the DPP to decide whether Mr McKinnon had a case to answer in the UK courts, and at that stage there was no live criminal investigation in England and Wales, nor had there been for many years. The DPP and the Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police therefore agreed to convene a joint police/CPS panel to consider whether the new criminal investigation should be commenced. None of the reasons for the original decision in 2002 that the appropriate place for Mr McKinnon to be tried was the United States have altered. So far as the evidence is concerned, the position of 2012 is the same as it is in 2002. Most of the witnesses are in the US, as is nearly all the physical evidence and the bulk of the unused material, some of which is sensitive. Accordingly, in November this year, the CPS and the police met senior officials from the US Department of Justice to discuss the possibility of bringing a US witness to England and Wales for trial, and of it transferring all the US material to this jurisdiction to be considered. The potential difficulties of bringing a case such as this to England and Wales now should not be underestimated. Not at least the passage of time, the logistics of transferring sensitive evidence prepared for a court in the US to London for trial, the participation of the US government witnesses in the trial, and the need to fully comply to the duties of disclosure imposed by the CPS. The prospects of a conviction against Mr McKinnon, which reflects the full extent of his alleged criminality, are not high. After consulting with the Metropolitan Police Service and the CPS, and having carefully considered the matters, on the 4th of December, the US authorities indicated to us that they would be willing to cooperate with a prosecution in England and Wales, if that were to serve in the interest of justice. However, they do not consider that making all the US witnesses available for trial in London and transferring all the US material to this jurisdiction would be in the interest of justice, given that our representations and the reasons for the decision that the US was the appropriate forum as set out above. That is the decision of the US authorities, and they are fully entitled to reach that, and we respect their decision. Against this background, the joint CPS/police panel recommended to assist the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police that he should not commence a new criminal investigation into Mr McKinnon. The Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has accepted this decision. Mr McKinnon has now reinvented himself and launched a small SEO site where he charges £40 an hour to help get businesses mentioned in search results. On his site, he says he has more than 20 years in experience in IT services. Search engine optimization, or SEO, is a strategy to make sure websites or web pages appear prominently in the Google or other search engines. The free Gary website is still up and running, and the site now links to Mr McKinnon's new services. On his website, he says, "My aim is to provide high quality SEO to small businesses and other individuals. All my clients so far have reached the first page of Google search results for their primary keywords." Some of the clients in his portfolio include the law firm Kane Todner, tutoring service GMAT Tutor London, and Jam, home of the egg roller and child safety doorstop. What are your opinions on the crimes committed by Gary McKinnon? Do you believe he was really looking for UFO and renewable energy, as well as other information? Or do you agree with the American government that Mr McKinnon caused significant damage to classified US weapons programs and should therefore be extradited to the US to appear before the court. Also, what are your opinions on the statements that were made before the Washington Press Club on the 9th of May 2001? Please let us know in the comments below. If you like this video today, please don't forget to subscribe. And as always, stay safe.